Good evening, everyone. For those in Australia, good evening and good morning to our wonderful guest speakers who are in the United Kingdom. My name is Michelle Maloney. I'm the National Convener of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, and we're really delighted to have you join us today for the first for our 2025 Bioregional Governance series of webinars. So I'll do a proper introduction and share some slides and get going. So, we were just saying before how we'd had no technical problems, and now I'm starting at the end. So please hold while I zoom to the beginning, and we'll edit that bit out, won't we, Sarah? So firstly, welcome to this evening's webinar. We're really looking forward to hearing from Isabel Carlisle and AELA Hubbard as they share some stories about bioregioning in the United Kingdom. I am based in Australia, for those who are joining us from overseas, and the Australian Earth Laws Alliance is based on this beautiful continent too. And it has become an important tradition for non-Indigenous people like myself, I'm non-Indigenous, to acknowledge whose country, whose traditional lands that we live, work and play on. So I'm really pleased and honoured to be living in one of the most beautiful places in the world, really, southeast Queensland. And I'm particularly here on Cubby Cubby country. And when I look out across that beautiful view of the Glasshouse Mountains, I'm looking out across Jinnaburra lands. So I would like to acknowledge the First Peoples of all of this continent. Since the British colonisation of this continent in 1788, the many hundreds of Aboriginal nations have been put under the duress and some of the terrible things that have happened through colonisation. And so it's really important in today's society to acknowledge what happened through the history of Australia and from many other countries around the world, and to acknowledge that the first peoples of this continent had a rich tapestry of deep culture, deep law, and relevant to this talk, this series that we're running on bioregional, Mary Graham has called one of the oldest continuous bioregional governance systems in the world. So I'd like to acknowledge that lands were never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And this map shows not just the map of Aboriginal languages, but again, as elders tell us, this is the beautiful patchwork quilt of complex governance and kinship systems that were here and continue to be here in Australia today. So a huge call out to any First Peoples joining us this evening or watching the recording. And it is with great respect that we within the Australian Earth Laws Alliance work with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues and acknowledge country and the elders and the peoples of this place. So, who's AELA? Let me just remind folks who might be new to us. We're a small not-for-profit organisation based in Queensland in Australia. We've been around for about 12 or 13 years. We're small and humble but mighty. We work to increase the understanding and practical implementation of Earth-centred governance across all human activities and scale. We're really interested in how we can shift the root causes of our ecological crises and how we can build governance systems to create ecologically healthy and socially just societies. And I don't always do this, but I wanted to refer our bioregional series to how we talk about governance, because some people's eyes glaze over when you talk about governance, despite me continually saying that governance is sexy stuff. Here at AELA, we're fascinated by the rules that we make as human beings to live, work and play together at any scale, whether our family sort of working out who's going to have the last piece of pizza on a Friday night, or high-level corporations or complex community groups. And for the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, or AELA, what we're interested in are the laws and the moral codes and the social norms and the way we organise to be a society. Because deep beneath all of those top layer things like what is the law, what's the morality, what are our norms, the culture, values and beliefs are deeply and profoundly important. And that brings us to the Bioregional Governance series. Why are we interested in bioregioning and bioregionalism? Well, it's because if you're interested in earth-centeredness, whether you're looking at Thomas Berry's book, The Great Work, and his call through earth jurisprudence for Western industrialized nations to become more connected and have a deeper relationship with nature, or whether you look at the ancient ongoing systems of First Peoples who were and often continue to be deeply connected to nature, it's the local and the intimate and the relational that helps truly guide us to be not only human beings, living beings on this earth, but also can give us the greatest source of information we need to live in a place forever, to live well, and to care for country. So we're interested in bioregioning because it's exciting. It connects us to the extreme diversity of plants and animals and ecosystems and the undulation of the earth and the kinds of grasses and the soils, the uniqueness of a place. But it also is a fantastic doorway into the important task of integrating complexity and bringing all of the different issues together to really rethink how we live, work, and play on this beautiful planet of ours. And I just want to give a plug so that people who might not know about the other webinars we ran last year. Fantastic session with my dear friend and incredibly respected Indigenous elder, Mary Graham. Really worth listening to her overview of that Aboriginal map of Australia and how that ancient governance system has so much to teach us, not just about bioregioning, but about governance and the way we interact with each other and country. And we also had some wonderful sessions with, I know, AELA's colleague on a couple of papers, Sam Warne, a really excellent introduction to bioregioning for those who might be new to the area. Ian Lowe gave us a wonderful talk about Western science, and we both went into an amazing discussion about governance possibilities in Australia. And the wonderful Shrishti Bajpai from the Global Tapestry of Alternatives and a number of other organisations talked about bioregioning in India and connecting it to our sister organisation, the New Economy Network Australia. We've been looking at also some of the issues that folks might think are more straightforward or economic, but in fact issues like housing and human settlements, when given a bioregional lens, can have some very different approaches and outcomes. All right, so that's the advertisement for all of the other recordings that you can watch. And next month, we're going to hear from some amazing folks from the US and later in the year from, I think, some other places that we're just teeing up now. Yeah, really, for us here in AELA, the questions we ask are about how our unique places can be supported. How do we organise our own human communities so that bioregions and catchments can be cared for and managed in similar ways and in partnership with Indigenous peoples here in Australia. So that's it from me. I'll come back to this at the end of our webinar. We love to invite people to connect with us and to connect with our work. But without further ado, I will stop sharing. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers, Isabel Carlisle and Ella Hubbard. How are you today, and how is the UK looking for you?
Well, right now it's looking a bit grey and gloomy, but I think, Ella, maybe you've got some more sunshine than I do.
Oh yeah, so I'm a lot further north than Isabel, and we've got beautiful, clear, sunny skies today for the first time in months. So yeah, beautiful day here.
Well, you celebrate that sunshine, and hopefully we can get you off this call and out there, very soon. So look, thank you so much for joining us. Really looking forward to hearing your stories about your work. So our webinar today, Isabel will go first, talk for 15 or 20 minutes, and then Ella will do the same, and then we'll open up for some Q&A. So for folks who are with us, please do pop your questions in the chat. And my wonderful AELA colleague, Sarah Bashforth, who I want to acknowledge, will also share those questions with me, and we'll facilitate some Q&A at the end with an expected finish-up time at 7:30 Brisbane time, which is 8:30 New South Wales. And that's the only time zone I'll translate because I'll just mess them up. So, right, without further ado, I'll take Ella and myself off spotlight, and we'll hand over to Isabel. Really looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. I'm so happy to be here. I was looking at the backgrounds to all of your photographs in the chat, in the screen, and just really enjoying seeing a completely different part of the world. So I haven't got any slides. I'm going to talk to you for about 20 minutes and hopefully inspire your imaginations to imagine the kind of country that I am in. But I'm going to describe all that. And I'm also going to talk you through the work of the Bioregional Learning Centre, which has been going for 8 years now here in South Devon, and home in on bioregional governance and how we are finding ways to work with existing power structures. But if I leave anything out, if you've got any questions for me later on, I would love to hear them, because I'm just going to give you a brief introduction, and there is so much I could say. Clearly, I can't say it all. So I am sitting in South Devon. So if you can imagine a map of England, in your bottom left corner, you've got a leg sticking out into the sea, and the far end of the leg is Cornwall, and right next to that is Devon. And South Devon is the kind of the bulgy bit that sticks out into the English Channel. So our bioregion is defined by water. We've defined it by the two rivers either side of us. So we've got the River Tamar on the west that divides Devon from Cornwall and has divided Devon from Cornwall since 936 AD. And then on the east, we've got the River Tean. In the north, we've got where all our rivers rise on Dartmoor. We've got 5 little rivers that run down to the sea at the bottom. And this question about how do you define your place? How do you know where the edges of your bioregion are? Maybe that's a good place for me to start, because for some years, we started doing this work, really absolutely committed to working with whole landscapes and whole systems. But people would say to us, how do you know where the edges of your bioregion are? And so one of the things we did was to do a regenerative design exercise, which layers up all the way from geology and deep time up through landscape patterns and rainfall and land use and social history and political history and culture right up to the present day, and looking for coherence through all those layers. It's a very good way of understanding where the edges of your bioregion are, because what you're looking for is that sense of identity and belonging. And the more you can tap into that sense of identity and belonging, the more you're able to kind of activate your bioregion and help people in your bioregion really understand how to think differently. So how to think systemically and how to think in whole landscapes, and to also kind of see where systems are colliding. So this very kind of deep felt sense of belonging is a slightly mysterious process, but I'm sure many of you listening today to this webinar will completely understand what I mean, is that when you are in your country, you know where you are, and it has a particular feel to it, and you know when you're leaving it, and you can describe it to other people. So that's kind of like, that's where we are right here. And in terms of the history of our place, so as you probably know, England has been colonized through the centuries from very early on by many different invaders. First of all, we didn't really think about colonization in the era of Neanderthal people. We certainly had Neanderthal people coming to the very edge of our country and then back again during the Ice Ages. And then when the Ice Ages finished 12,000 years ago, the English Channel was formed, so we became an edge place. We were on the edge of the sea, which we weren't before. And then, of course, you got people coming from across the sea to colonize this place, because this place is rich in minerals like copper and tin. And then you've got the Celts coming, and then you've got the Roman invasion. We were thoroughly colonized then. And then you've got the Anglo-Saxons coming, and then you've got the Normans. So it's kind of like we are really a tapestry of all these different cultures that have kind of merged together. And perhaps it's no accident that then we, the English and the Scots, became the colonizers in the 18th, 19th, even early 20th centuries, because we had that history of colonization within us. So we defined our bioregion as South Devon, and we pay a lot of attention to systems. So as I said at the beginning, we work with whole landscapes and whole systems. Our current political system, which is operating at regional level, so we've got regional governance and county governance and central governance. But anyway, the regional governance splits our bioregion in half from east to west. So the top half of our bioregion is where all our rivers rise, and the bottom half is where they end up in the sea. And we're saying that does not make any sense at all. We need to be able to plan, and in the planning system, be able to look at whole rivers and whole landscapes and manage them as a whole, and give civil society way more of a say in how we manage those whole systems. So just to touch back into how we think about systems. So we talk quite a lot about where systems collide. So one aspect of the story of bioregioning is that enable us to really kind of think differently. And thinking differently, I think, is what we need to do right now, to really kind of flip our relationship with the natural world, to be able to see the role of humans in relation to the natural world as being part of that world, and to be much more discerning about our impact on that natural world, but also to really kind of challenge existing power structures and how they work. So we talk about where systems collide as being the friction points and the leverage points. So if any of you know Donella Meadows' work, she was like the grandmother of systems thinking in the days when it was called cybernetics, back in the 1970s, 1980s. And one of the things that she did was that in 1980, she started something called the Balaton Group on Lake Balaton in Hungary. And at that time, she was thinking very much about bioregions and bioregional learning centers. And she wrote a very fascinating paper in around 1980, which you can access through our website, the Bioregional Learning Center. I wrote a blog about it. And she really kind of laid out the essentials for a bioregional learning center, which I will get back to. Let me just go back one step towards systems. So we talk about geosystems on the move. So we know that we are living through a period of destabilizing Earth systems, whether you're talking about the melting ice caps or what's happening to the Amazon rainforest or to ice shelves around the world, or to coral reefs, or to what we call the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation or the Gulf Stream. We know they are all being disrupted, and that they are intersecting, this disruption is intersecting in unpredictable ways, which amplifies the disruption. In your bioregion, in your place, we can experience that disruption. And we say that where systems collide, where geosystems on the move collide with our local ecosystems, collide with our local human systems, like transport or housing or health, there we've got those friction points. So often it's easiest to see systems where they collide, but we say those friction points are also our leverage points. And they're the places that we can really kind of work into. And by taking people into those spaces and really unpacking what we're seeing there, and then figuring out what to do about it, we are starting to exercise bioregional governance. Because clearly, it's not going to be possible for governments alone, or for businesses alone, or for academia alone to solve this huge challenge that we have of adapting to the change in our climate. And of course, all the associated disruptions that are coming with that. So of course, it's not just our climate, it's also our political system that's being disrupted, our economic system, the gross inequity between rich and poor, but they're all being amplified by climate change. So we use the kind of the imperative for climate adaptation as our way in. And that is our way in to thinking about bioregional government, because it's become such an issue for central government and county council government and district government. We don't talk up front so much about bioregions and regenerative design, but we do talk a lot about climate adaptation. So we do bioregioning by stealth a bit, because we know that to bring in a very novel idea, which encompasses everything, because bioregioning is a kind of, it's a whole thesis, if you like, of how to think about your local place and how to take care of it and how to live in it, because that's pretty challenging to a lot of people. We go in through this doorway of climate adaptation. And so we are working with our local district council at the moment to create what we call a joined up adaptation strategy. And within that context, it's beginning to make sense to people in government that you cannot just kind of work within the restrictions of the current government pattern of where the boundaries are, that we really need to kind of transcend those boundaries and work with whole bioregions or whole landscapes, whole systems. So we ran a learning journey back in last June to take people from our local district council and also people in community groups working on climate change and climate adaptation around our bioregion to look at what the issues are. So I want to paint a picture of what we found, because it may resonate with some of you in Australia. So we are having much more coastal flooding because there's much more energy in the wind and the wave systems. So that when we get a low pressure system coming over and it's also low tide, it means the tide is able to rise higher. And if we've got a kind of big storm coming in at the same time, we're getting much more flooding. So we're having communities that are having to get out the sandbags way more often, and they're getting used to the fact that that they can't simply rely on the Environment Agency to come and make it okay. But we also see where these issues kind of really rise to the surface, the challenge we have of all these different agencies needing to work together, and none of them really taking responsibility for how this community is going to manage itself in the future. So that's one way in which bioregioning can come in and start to kind of say, guys, you're part of a whole system. You know, we need to look at the whole system and figure out who takes responsibility for what, and also how we bring civil society into that decision-making process and into thinking about how we move forward. Another thing that we really experienced on the learning journey was that communities are starting to take issues into their own hands where they can. So for instance, we get a lot of potholes in our roads because of heavier rainfall, also because there's more traffic. Electric cars are heavier and they wear away the roads much more. And so communities getting fed up with kind of constantly having to take their cars to the garage to be repaired. They managed to get the equipment and the training that they needed to mend the potholes in the roads themselves. But in order to be able to do that, they went on the course that was supplied by our county council in road management. And through getting that training, they also then had access to the public liability insurance of Devon County Council, because without that kind of backup, that legal backup on taking that risk in repairing roads, which normally does not fall to communities, they were able to go ahead. So just one last example, we also saw and went to talk to quite a few farmers who are taking the risk of farming for the future, so adapting their farming methods in order to be able to cope with climate change. Of course, they're taking a risk because they are doing something that hasn't necessarily been trialed before, or certainly not trialed in their spot. And here in South Devon, we see that farms, even just a few miles from each other, have radically different soil type, and some of them, you know, within about half an hour's drive, you can get 10 inches of rain a year, or you can get 50 inches of rain a year. But it's kind of like, yes, there's huge disparity. So each farm manages itself differently. And they're all, if they care about the future, they're all taking a risk. And how do you back that risk up? How do you help those farms to shoulder the risk? Because unless we're able to do these experiments and figure out what's actually going to work in the future, it's going to be very hard to prepare for that future that's coming over the horizon. So that's another thing that we're looking at, how to help all these kind of experiments shoulder the risk they need to take. So that's probably almost enough from me. Let me think about if there's, in my last 3 minutes, is there anything else I can share? Well, what we're working on at the moment is that we're fortunate to have enough core funding to start to put what we call 3 pillars underneath our bioregion. So one pillar is data and evidence, and enabling local citizens to be able to see what's going on in such a way that they can generate data and evidence from lived experience, that they can share that data and evidence, and that they can then use that data and evidence to make a case for the changes they need in their place. And that, of course, leads into governance, because data and evidence are the lifeblood of governance. And so we're looking at what bioregional governance would look like, using climate adaptation as our doorway in, to be able to say, we think that for climate adaptation, we need a citizens forum. not a citizens council that just meets once and disappears. We need a forum that meets regularly, in which we can bring local citizens, community groups, and so on, to meet with people who are experts in different fields, in people in government, people in public utility companies, and so on. So that's one way of thinking about bioregional governance. Another project that we did sometime back now, I think it was 2018, was that we made a charter for our river to give moral rights to the river. There is no way in English law we can give legal rights to our river, but we can give it moral rights and ethical rights. So we gave river the right to flow from source to sea and not to be polluted and so on. And we would like to continue that work, which relates very closely, of course, to earth law. And we're in conversations with other rivers who are also pursuing earth law in different ways. Many of them are coming around to the idea that a charter is probably the way to go. And we have a long tradition of charters in this country, both the Charter of the Forest, which in fact started here in Devon in 1204 and became part of Magna Carta in 1225. And the last pillar is bioregional finance. So bioregional finance is being talked about a lot around the world, and different bioregions are trying to figure out, how do you do this bioregional finance in such a way that you create a container into which can come government funding, philanthropic funding, venture capital, maybe bond issues, and these different instruments in this kind of menu of ways in which the bioregion can have access to the finance it needs to take the action it needs to take, recognizing that government is not going to be able to finance all the issues that we need to solve. And a lot of what we do in the bioregion is not so much about built infrastructure, because we don't have the capacity to do that part. It's much more about citizens stepping forward and being able to take action in their own places. So with that, I'm going to stop now and hand back to Michelle.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Oh, so many questions I have for you. Very tempting and tantalizing, I think I'm trying to say. But thank you so much, Isabel. We'll definitely be coming back shortly for some questions. And what I'll do now is I'll bring Ella back into the spotlight, literally. So Ella, thanks so much for joining us. Looking forward to your presentation now. And I'll take Isabel and myself out of the spotlight. And then we'll come back after Ella's given her talk for some questions and discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my slides. So bear with me. See if this will allow me to present. There we go. So hopefully everyone can see that all right. So it's so good to be here. I feel really kind of humbled to be invited, especially to speak alongside someone like Isabel. So I'm Ella. I completed my PhD on bioregioning about a year ago. So in some ways it feels really fresh. In other ways, I feel like I'm going back in time, trying to remember all of these ideas that I had and all these conversations that really shaped that PhD. So my PhD was called Bioregioning, a Politics of Place for Living Well Together. And it's really about the kind of ideas that underpin bioregional thought and how they help us rethink the economy. So my research worked with a group in Scotland, in Tayside, and a group in America. So it's not just stories from the UK. And mostly I'm going to be talking about the kind of ideas rather than the bioregions themselves, because they aren't my place. I don't live there. And so some of those stories aren't my own. But I have been thinking about bioregions and bioregioning for about 4 years. So hopefully I've got some kind of provocations to share with you and some ideas to start conversations. But I think anyone who's thought about anything for a long period of time is kind of realizes that the more you think about these things, sometimes the more of a beginner you feel. So hopefully kind of building on some of the things that Isabel has spoken about and starting some conversations really. So I started my PhD in October 2019, which if we all kind of cast our minds back, means that after less than 6 months of doing my PhD, the UK went into its first COVID lockdown. So suddenly my place in the world went from feeling quite big to really, really small. Just the kind of parks and roads near my house, and mainly as a PhD student, this tiny little desk that I had in a bedroom. But at the same time, it completely opened up my world. So I had all these connections that I otherwise wouldn't have had. So people like Isabel, also Sam, who's spoken in this series, and the two groups that are at the centre of my PhD, who I'll introduce in a minute. And so all of those felt quite a long way from my home, but that lockdown really opened up all of these virtual connections. So through my whole PhD, I had this kind of tension of writing a PhD, which was really about connection to place, being in the world, kind of understanding your place in the world, and feeling at the same time really disconnected from place, and particularly those places that I was working with. So this presentation is going to be kind of placing myself in my thinking and this kind of journey of thinking that I went on through my PhD, and why this idea of bioregioning, and me and Isabel use this idea of bioregioning as a verb, how we kind of conceptualize that and what turning bioregionalism into a verb really does. So I'll just begin by kind of introducing where my thought came from, because I didn't enter this really from even an environmental perspective. I was very much thinking about the economy. So for me, this really started in 2014 when I was doing my master's, and that was at Bristol University, which is much closer to Isabel than where I am now. And at the time, I was researching a community centre. And so it was miles from Sheffield, and even further from the kind of bioregions that I researched in my PhD. And what I was interested in is looking at these spaces that weren't typically capitalist, but they also weren't anti-capitalist either. They were sort of somewhere in the middle. So this photo here is a mural which is on the side of the building. So you can see it's a Banksy. So it's quite this kind of cool and interesting site in the city. But the whole purpose of the community centre was to provide space for the community. It was not profit making, and all of that value that was created there was shared by the users of that space. So I was really interested in these things that were kind of happening in the cracks of capitalism. And so what I was interested in is how can we sort of reshape the economy in ways that serve the community, the people that are living in a place, rather than kind of going to kind of private shareholders or take the value taken away from that community. And there's two thinkers that were really important to me and remain really important to me, which are the feminist geographers Gibbs and Graham. They write together under the name Gibbs and Graham. And one of the things that they argue really strongly throughout all of their work is that the way we think and talk about the economy shapes what is possible. So we often say places like this community centre that I was working in, we talk about them as being small, they're only local, they're kind of marginal. And in doing that, particularly as researchers, we often make them more likely to fail. We say capitalism is powerful, it will co-opt all of these different alternatives, and it will make them kind of marginal. And the way that we talk and think about the economy kind of creates that and makes that more likely to happen. And so they have this kind of mantra that, particularly as researchers, to change our understanding is to change the world. And sometimes that's in quite small ways, but that can be quite major. You know, often research is informing policy, it has real world impacts. So that idea was kind of profound for me. And I finished my master's and I went on to do other things, but I still had all of these questions about how can we rethink the economy? How do we make all of these alternatives possible? Kind of how do we bring these other worlds into being? And how can we demonstrate that, you know, capitalism might be really powerful, but it's not all that there is. There are other things out there. So yeah, a few years went by, and so I came back and do my PhD, and that was, you know, 5 years later on. And by that time, it became really clear to me that rethinking the economy couldn't just be about rethinking human livelihoods anymore. We also had to think about the environment as part of that. And so I was thinking about these ideas of, you have the economy, which is this sort of almost kind of physical law, the way we talk about it. You know, it's got rules, it's got its own logics, we can't really control it, it's outside of us. And that's the only way that we make a living. And then we've got our kind of human societies. And so the environment is just whatever's left. It might be the resources that we draw on, or a kind of space that we dump waste into, but it's distinctly non-human. and it's kind of whatever's left over that's not the economy and it's not human. And that way of thinking kind of masks our relationship, not only with other humans, but non-human species as well. So I kind of began exploring what different frameworks might be out there to help us think about the economy, humans, and the environment all together, and how can we see that interdependence, and what ways of thinking can help us live well together in that space of interdependence. So that is how I came into this idea of bioregioning and bioregionalism. So my PhD was very much thinking about bioregioning as a sort of ethics of the economy and a strategy for sort of changing the way we think about the economy. So to do that work, I spent lots of time with a group in Casco Bay in Maine. So it's on the east coast of America, just where this red dot is. So it's kind of nested in the wider Gulf of Maine. It's a really beautiful bioregion. It's coastal. There's, you know, in the bay, there's 365 islands. So it's known as the Calendar Islands. It's the indigenous lands of the Wabanaki people. And so I've got some images here to kind of give you a flavor of what it's like. You've got these really iconic lighthouses. So there's lots of films are filmed in these lighthouses. This really vibrant kind of blue economy. So lots of lobster, a lot of these kind of like traditional New England things that we imagine, and some really valuable ecosystems. So you've got huge amounts of salt marsh, for example. So I spent a month in Maine, but also a lot of time online working with them through their learning journeys. The second group that I spoke to were Bioregioning Tayside in Scotland. And so the team at Bioregioning Tayside, they've been such an important part of my journey. I can't kind of emphasize that enough. It's really shaped the way I think. So Tayside is the watershed of the River Tay. Like Isabel mentioned, I think in the UK, rivers and water are a really important part of our kind of landforms. They really shape our experience. They shape the topography. And in Scotland, you also get a lot of flooding. So rivers are incredibly important kind of markers of bioregions. So I don't know how well you can see on this map, but the star is the kind of center of the bioregion. So the River Tay flows through Dundee, but it's also situated along the Highland boundary fault line. So you can see you've got this kind of lowland landscape, and then north of Dundee, the landscape completely changes and you get the Highlands, and that's the start of the kind of Cairngorm mountain range. And the photo on the screen is taken looking straight at that fault line. So you've got this flat agricultural land, and then it suddenly starts. You can just see at the far end of the photo, the landscape beginning to change and getting more mountainous. So this is also quite an important cultural landscape in Scotland. So you've got the lowlands, which were much more agricultural, more easily colonised by the British, and then the Highlands, where you had a clan structure, much more difficult landscape to live in. So I'm not going to talk about my whole PhD in this presentation because it's just too much. So instead, I'm going to talk about what I think is one of the most important parts of it, which is this shift from talking about bioregions and bioregionalism to turning it into a verb, and what that has meant in Scotland and in America as well. So it doesn't feel like there's too much need to talk about definitions in this group. I think everyone here is at least a little bit familiar with the idea of bioregions, or at least what it means to them. But it is, I think, useful to kind of just get back to that core idea, because it is the foundational concept of bioregionalism. And that's saying that bioregions are about looking for natural kind of boundaries in the landscape rather than the human political boundaries. So there's lots of different ways we can think about that, or that you could draw that boundary, and they might be different depending on where you are in the world. But this idea of kind of going back to what is in nature rather than humans. So on the screen here, I've got two images, which are both from Tayside, and you can just see the amazing colours of this landscape. Every time I see these kind of muted, desaturated tones, it just reminds me of Scotland. But the image on the right is from the Dundee Botanical Gardens, and they were creating almost a little bioregion in itself of Tayside, where they've got all of the different species that you kind of find in this landscape, all of the native species. So it's kind of like a little mini bioregion. So that to me is like, what what is a bioregion when you're looking at the kind of natural landscape. But there's also this idea, which also Isabel spoke about, of these kind of terrains of consciousness, or this feeling of being at home, and the sort of cultural landscape that makes a bioregion as well. So on the left, we've got an event that I went to, which was run by Bioregioning Tayside. We've got a storyteller who's telling stories about kind of Scottish mythology. We've got children who are bringing up native tree saplings up as an offering. This gentleman here is playing a carnix, which is a kind of ancient instrument that was played in these kinds of landscapes. So you've got this kind of like natural landscape, but also this cultural landscape, which together make a bioregion. And what I think is still so attractive about idea is that this idea is it brings us back down to earth. You know, our livelihoods are rooted in real places. Our materials come from somewhere, our waste goes somewhere. We're interacting with real ecosystems, and that shapes how we live, and it should shape how we live. So we've got this idea of bioregions. And then for me, when it becomes an ism, when it becomes bioregionalism, it's about becoming a principle and a practice of living in accordance with that landscape, with that ecology, in really sensitive ways. So I'm sure many people are familiar with the idea of re-inhabitation, which comes from some of those older bioregional texts. This idea of kind of learning to live in place, and what does that mean? So this photo for me kind of illustrates some of that ideas. So we're out on a Scottish loch in a coracle, which is a sort of customary boat. It's made of willow and cowhide. So it's kind of made of these local materials and these skills and materials that we sort of have to hand in place. And so it's kind of an example of how can we live in a sort of flourishing way in our bioregion? What are the things that we have available to us, and how can we live sustainably? But what was really interesting for me is when I kind of started speaking to people in Scotland and the Casco Bay team, I noticed that in practice, people were actually quite vague about what their bioregion really was. So like Isabel said, people going, well, how do I find the edges? And, you know, I came in and I was saying, well, can you show me on a map? Where is your bioregion? And everyone was really fuzzy about it. You know, they were like, well, it's kind of here, but sometimes we might include this, or sometimes we might talk about it like that. So it was a lot more open than this sort of old definition of bioregions allowed. And at the same time, they were talking about bioregioning as a verb rather than as an ism. So for me, that was really interesting. I was like, what is going on here? Because that seems quite different from the sort of older bioregional text that I was reading. So what I felt it kind of came down to was this slight discomfort with the idea of a bioregion being a static place. So if we go back a couple of slides, like these images of Scotland, they kind of speak to like a particular imagination of what Scotland is, what being Scottish is. And that's quite historically specific. And it doesn't leave much room for change, you know, different people coming into the bioregion, different forms of livelihood. So what, for me, turning it into a verb does is it kind of opens up this question of what is our bioregion? So who belongs here? What are we excluding and what are we including when we talk about the bioregion? And it also turns it into a kind of action. So people who read a lot of literature on the commons will have also heard the term commoning as a verb. And what that does is it kind of turns our attention to the forms of labour, the forms of practice that it takes to create and sustain a commons. And for me, that's what bioregioning is doing. It's saying, how do we bring our bioregion into existence kind of in our minds as a place, as a site of action, but also as a physical flourishing system. So it turns the attention to that. And in doing so, it kind of, yeah, it makes it open. It makes it a site of politics again to say, what imaginations are valid here? Who's flourishing we're talking about, and who belongs? And also it turns it into a process of something that is being made all the time, and it can be remade, and it can be remade differently, which I think is really important. And so as Isabel has kind of spoken about, the groups I worked with were using this idea of learning journeys as a tool of bioregioning. And what that was doing was looking at, as Isabel describes, like the kind of deep time, the geological history, the social history, but also the kind of regenerative projects that are happening now. And for me, those learning journeys were really this kind of process of destabilizing You know, rather than saying this is our history of place and it is fixed, and this is what it means to be Scottish, or this is what it means to live in Casco Bay, and that can't be changed. It kind of made it open again. It said this way of living is really historically contingent, and therefore it can be different. So you had this learning of what your place is, this developing love and sense of connection, learning to see bioregional health, but it also was this kind of subjective process of kind of opening up that bioregion and figuring out what it means to live in that place. And so just to kind of bring it back to why I think this is about economy, really, is this really useful tool that I've come across called Ecological Livelihoods. So this book here is by Ethan Millett, really brilliant. It can be quite a difficult read, but it really kind of helped me understand what I thought bioregioning was all about. And so Miller's talking about we need to stop thinking about the economy and the environment and society as these three separate spheres. And sometimes we might imagine them as like overlapping spheres. Sometimes we imagine them as kind of a nested hierarchy where you've got the economy is nested in with the environment. And he's saying even thinking about it in that way is kind of getting in our way of thinking about how we can flourish and how we can live well together. And so instead he talks about ecological livelihood, and that's this diagram at the bottom. So he's saying instead we can think about it as we make our own livelihoods, and that might be through the economy, it might be through all of the kind of reproductive and non-monetary labor that takes place. That's one part of our livelihood. But in doing that, in kind of creating our livelihood, we're also being made by others. And for me, this is the kind of bioregional part. Other species, the landscape are also shaping what livelihood is possible for us. And as we are kind of being made by others and making livelihoods for ourselves, at the same time, we're creating livelihoods for others. So that might be other humans, it might be the habitats that we're making for other species. It's the kind of conditions that we are creating through our livelihoods for others to flourish. And at the center of that is this idea of ecological livelihood. So for me, that kind of like really gets to the heart of what a bioregion is. It's sort of understanding all of this into different interdependence. And it's a really useful kind of set of coordinates for thinking, because what it opens up is these questions of who or what is making us and how do we support their flourishing? What livelihoods are we making for others? And are they good? Are they productive? Are we excluding some species from our imagination of what our bioregion is? And who and what is being prioritized in those discussions? And for me, once you turn bioregioning into a verb, it kind of opens up those political questions. It makes us lay it all out and say, well, actually, when we're talking about our bioregion, this is what is included and this isn't, and this is why. And sometimes these can be really difficult conversations. And so what it does to me as well is like helps us see the bioregion as something that's a kind of relationship, it's a set of interdependencies, and it's something that isn't static as well. It can change, it can be dynamic, our knowledge can change. So rather than saying we need to go back to Scottish Indigenous knowledge, understanding that that knowledge itself was dynamic, you know, it wasn't just one thing that we need to come back to. So for me, this idea of like bioregioning and ecological livelihoods is something that kind of makes our connection to place political again, if you see what I mean. And I think particularly from a UK perspective, connection to place can be quite, I don't know, try and seem innocent when it isn't, and it kind of ignores a lot of other relationships. But turning it into a verb, thinking about ecological livelihoods is a lens to kind of really get into those political questions at the heart of this. So in the interest of time, I think I'll kind of wrap up there. And I hope there's some kind of provocations within that. But yeah, I think my kind of key message is that bioregioning is really about not seeing place as static. It's about kind of rejecting some of those essentialized ideas of place and nature and inviting us into that messy work of living together. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry, that some strange message is coming to me. I shall ignore it. Thank you so much, Ella. That was lovely. And we have got a lot of questions coming in. So what I'll try to do is group a couple of them together. And I think together, your insights into what both the theory and the work that you're doing is really fascinating. What I might do is just jump in with a question for each of you first, and then I'll go through the questions that have come for us. I was just wondering, Isabel, there's many topics that you touched on that I'm fascinated by, and I want to do a lot more reading about the work that you guys and girls are doing. But I loved your three pillars and the data and evidence that you talked about, developing the data and evidence for making a case for the changes that the community want. Are you able to talk just briefly about, I don't know, either some examples of what you're doing or systems or mechanisms you're using? What are you actually looking at in that data space?
Okay, that's a nice question. So we're putting together two experiences that we've had within the last 10 years. So one experience is creating the donut for Devon, the donut economic ecological analysis of our whole county, which we did in fact during lockdowns. We did all online. We met for coffee and donuts every fortnight, every 2 weeks online. And with a whole collective, we created this kind of donut for Devon. What we came up with was not just making it real for the people of Devon, not abstract. We also came up with this process. So the process was that in order to understand how we could shift the needle on a domain of the donut, so anyone who hasn't seen the donut, it looks like a pizza, and you're cutting these kind of triangular slices in a way out of the pizza or out of the ring. So that's a domain. It could be coastal marine health, it could be ocean acidification, it could be livelihoods. So we realized that in order to shift the needle on any domain, we had to really identify what the key scenario was in that domain, that if we could shift the needle on that scenario would shift the domain. So we got these groups of experts in who are working on the ground in that particular field. And together we kind of figured out what that key scenario was. And then we went deeper into saying, how would we know that we were shifting the needle? What would be the metrics and indicators that showed that the action that we wanted to take was making a difference? And then we came up with pathways to action. But what was key to that was that we had parallel pathways for citizens and policymakers. In fact, we had parallel indicators and metrics for citizens on the one hand and policymakers on the other hand. So if anyone's interested in that work, there is a whole website for the Devon Donut, and you can go into it and you can drill down into this kind of graphic of the interactive donut and really figure out how we did that. So there's that experience. And the other experience, which is more personal to myself because it's not really a bioregional learning center project, but anyway, I was involved in a project that started probably in about 16, 17, maybe even earlier, maybe actually earlier, 2013, to make a charter, a community charter for people in a part of Scotland called Falkirk who were opposing fracking. So there was a big company called INEOS that wanted to frack the central belt of Scotland, which is where, which used to be the coal mining area of Scotland. If there's no longer coal mining, there's gas instead. There's coal bed methane and other kinds of gas, which is underneath the coal fields. So anyway, cutting a long story short, we helped them make a community charter. The community charter became a way of convening public collective will around the very kind of logical and scientific reasons why fracking would destroy that community. And so that whole process of making the charter, and again, you can find that online, and there's a charter for St. Ives in Cornwall that was based on that charter, which is probably easier for you to find if you go online. So that charter making process took you so far because it names all the assets in the community that you care about. And then we wanted to take it further. So I worked with St. Ives in Cornwall to figure out how we could create a community knowledge network that would look at each asset, like coastal marine health or our beautiful public spaces or vibrant local economy, or not. Actually, it's not very vibrant there. It's overwhelmed by tourism. But anyway, for each asset to overlay that with the Devon donut process and be able to assess the health of that asset, and to make it possible for the community, through creating a citizen knowledge network, to be the assessors of the health of the asset, and then to be able to represent that asset in decision making of whatever kind. So sorry, that was quite a long explanation, but that's
No,
where we're heading in South Devon. We're kind of smushing up those experiences and taking that forward.
No, thank you. For anyone who knows some of the early work we've been developing in our little Greenprints program, some of that is actually what we look at, which is, how do you even know what you're aiming for? You know, I often laugh that a lot of Western sustainability approaches are endless improvement without having a benchmark for when do we get there? And in a country like Australia, where the colonial impacts are relatively young compared to some places, in some places only 100, 120 years have landscapes been altered, there is a wonderful benchmark for what does health look like, and what is it exactly, which part of our ecology and social life are we aiming for? So to me, you know, what is the end game is always the burning question. You know, what are we working towards? So so thank you for those answers, and I'll definitely be looking around. And for those who don't know, Regen Melbourne have been doing a lot of work around the donut. They've been doing that for a couple of years. So there is an Australian group there doing, I think Regen Sydney used the donut too. I'm a huge fan of Donut Economics by Kate Raworth, which in turn was, she came out of, you know, looking at the planetary boundary stuff, and our beloved late friend Will Steffen provided a huge amount of input to Kate's modelling. So yeah, really important. Thank you for that initial question, Isabel. Ola, if I could turn to you now, back to your PhD and the communities that you looked at. You mentioned the communities in Maine and in Scotland. I was just curious, did you look at any what's allegedly called global South communities, or were you looking primarily at the US and the UK?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and it also kind of prompts something that's come up in the chat as well. So the examples I was looking at that formed the main body of my PhD was Scotland and America. But the work that I did with Sam, we looked at kind of this idea of what bioregionalism and bioregioning means in different places. And, you know, we spent hours and hours arguing over Zoom about how that probably means something different, you know, in the UK and in America as well. And someone has put in the chat, you know, that in Australia, you have those kind of bioregional boundaries that are defined, and you have Indigenous Australians that have done that work. And I think it's really important to say that the UK and, like, to some extent, the American perspective is quite different. Our baselines are different. We don't have that, as you were saying, that sort of recent colonization. Those baselines are sort of gone, and the conversation in the UK isn't about going back to a sort of pre-human landscape. So I think it's really important to note that I think the kind of politics of this in the UK is really different to Australia. So my research was very much looking at those.
Yeah,
those
and the only reason
experiences.
I asked is certainly what we find in Western places like Australia is that in reality, community building and bioregioning is much harder than in communities where people actually still need each other to get about their day and to support each other's work. And I was just going to ask, did you find that some of the communities, did anyone ever talk about how difficult it can actually be to get people away from their TV and their isolated life to actually come out and play with other humans, to even think more explicitly about bioregioning? It's just a comment I've heard from many community development workers in Australia, which is some countries are way easier to do community building work in because they literally still come together to build things and do things. Whereas in Australia, we have wonderful communities, but sometimes they're a little hard to form around those kinds of activities. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that? Any observations?
Yeah, definitely. And I think what you find as well is when you're working with kind of community groups, you're already engaging with the people who want to do that work. So you're not speaking to the people who don't know and don't care, or are unable to because of time and other pressures in their life. And I think what particularly in Scotland, some of the challenges is also the attachments that people have to place are to these landscapes that are really altered. You know, you think about Scotland, it's these big open estates and this kind of pride in that landscape, which is actually quite a degraded an altered landscape. So how do you get people to form attachments to something that is really different to what they know and love? And I think that is also quite a major challenge in the UK, is these things that we think of as beautiful and stark are actually what we need to get away from. So I think there's two challenges there. There's this community building and engagement part of it, and then there's this shifting understanding of, you're not just trying to build attachment to the place that's existing, you're building it to this place that people can't necessarily imagine or don't associate with. So I think there's two kind of challenges that go together in the UK.
No, I think for many places around the world, that would be a shared experience. And certainly I always have to kind of point out to people who are focused very much on place building or place making, that what we're interested in as AELA and Earth-centered humans is, well, actually what human beings want is one thing, but the reason I love bioregional framing is it's saying, what you want is one thing, but if you live in a desert, that's going to govern what you can do as a human being. And if you live in a jungle, that's going to govern what you can do. And honestly, that mindset of, as Isabel said, turning that around, flipping it around and saying, what's possible in this place and how can we live here forever? And also those other questions, what does ecological health look like here, and who chooses that, who determines that? I know they're all really complex questions, but I still find even now that I'm often that lone ecocentric voice annoying everybody else in the room who's focusing on the economy by saying, well, you want to do that to the river, but can the river handle that? Is this the right way to look after this place? Will you be able to live here forever if you trash the headwaters? Anyway, so for me, those are really important questions wherever we go. But thank you for those comments, Ella. All right, I'm going to turn to the questions we have from our wonderful participants. There's a question here from Alison. I think it was for Isabel when it was asked. A great activity question there. Question for later. How was the initial regenerative design exercise organised? And I guess this is for the whole project that you're working on, Isabel. How was it launched and who was involved? Not small questions at all. Advice to another region wanting to initiate this sort of thinking. What are some of the steps? Thank you.
Very nice question. Okay, so I'm part of a international group called the Bioregional Learning Alliance, and we are about to launch a webinar series that will start on the 22nd of April, which I will forward the information to Michelle once it's ready. And I and my co-founder of Bioregional Learning Center, Jane Brady, on the 22nd of April, and I realize the time's not going to be great for you guys, but you can sign up and get the recordings. We're going to be walking you through all the steps that we took. So, so there's that. So how did we do it? So in our early days, when we had absolutely no funding, all we could do is kind of work on projects with collaborators who had got funding. One of the things we did was work in Northwest Plymouth. So Plymouth is one of our local big cities in our bioregion. And we had a project which was restoring some local streams because there'd been a bad toxic spill that had killed the fish. But anyway, we took the opportunity then to create a story of place for Northwest Plymouth, which is on our website. So I'll put the link in the chat in a minute. So that kind of takes you through how we did this. So you start by looking at the geology, and then you kind of bring in all this research into the rainfall and the landscape and how it's changed, and the social histories, where you went back to I guess, what do you call that kind of assessment that the first Norman kings did of the Doomsday Book? So we went back to the Doomsday Book and we kind of layered it up, and we looked at kind of all the trade of the port of Plymouth and all the wars that the ships from Plymouth had sailed out to fight, etc., etc. Anyway, so we created a story of place, and the story of place helps you understand who the place is and how the place functions, how it relates to surrounding places, how it relates to the whole nation that you're in. And it gives you this kind of way of talking about your place, which is completely grounded in the reality of the place. So once you've done that part, you take people, you can represent it to people. So communicating is clearly important, how you communicate it. Then you can start to think about your learning journey. So you take people on a learning journey to talk about what Ella was talking about, which is kind of where the green shoots of regeneration or resilience, like who's doing the work that is really thinking about the future. So future livelihood, future well-being, future health of land and people, etc., etc. And then you kind of, again, reflect that back out into the bioregions. You're constantly having to help people see their bioregion in these different ways, which is where website and graphic design and animation, and so all these things come in very handy. And then we did this whole kind of huge collaborative Devon donut process. So we found that really valuable because that was all about convening and action learning and thinking about experts and their intelligence, set aside the lived experience of ordinary people. So I won't go into this in huge detail because that is also on our website, but we find that starting with story of place and that deep experience of regeneratively thinking about how this place could be if it's functioning at its best, we find that's a really good place to start because it loops back to what Michelle was saying about kind of how do we know where we want to get to. So imagining if your place could function at its best as a bioregion, it would look like this. That's a super helpful exercise to do.
Sorry, I was so busy listening, I forgot to unmute myself. No, thank you, Isabel. That's wonderful insights, and it sounds like your website has lots of great material. All right, moving on to some more questions. This one is a tricky one. It's from David, and I'm going to put it to both of our speakers. You may have read it in the comments already. Will English bioregions recognise the ecological debt owed to many in the global south? It's a tough question.
I think it's a really important one. I think it kind of is the key challenge maybe at the heart of particularly kind of UK bioregionalism. And it's something that was really interesting working in Tayside and in Casco Bay, because through that story of place in Tayside, they kind of uncovered a lot of this. So they started off looking at the clearances in Scotland where people were, through the Industrial Revolution, cleared from the landscape. And what they found was a lot of people who were cleared from the land in Scotland literally went and colonized the land in Maine, which I was looking at. And I think, again, by sort of taking bioregioning as a verb, it helps you sort of uncover those dynamics. It takes the focus away from your place. And I'm really influenced by the work of Val Plumwood and her idea of shadow places. And, she was super critical of bioregionalism and the way it kind of hides those uncomfortable questions of, you can love these beautiful places. Scotland's gorgeous. It's really easy to love it and to ignore how your life in Scotland is actively degrading other places. But I think by turning it into a verb, it helps us to understand those dynamics. But I think what I would say, and Isabel, please challenge me if you don't think this is fair, I think the process helps people to understand that. I think the target of action is still very much starting from where you are, which can be productive. It's the tools and things that people have to hand. But I think, in bioregioning, it is about your home place. And so you might understand those dynamics. But I think, unless Isabel wants to challenge me, I think the target of action is still very much at home. And I think that's something that's really important to recognise.
Yeah,
thank you, Ella. Isabel.
I'm not going to challenge you at all, Ella. I'm going to just kind of add another layer. I mean, yes, all the people doing bioregioning have very few resources, and we totally focus on what we can do in our own bioregion. However, I did see that question in the chat, and I've been thinking about it. The global north is doing bioregioning very differently from the global south. I should start by saying that. But we hope that by acknowledging the importance of bioregions and how we think about our places in that bioregional way, we're totally validating what has been going on in the global south, which you're so fortunate to have. I mean, we don't have a clear definition of the edges of our bioregion. We do know that we inhabit the land of a Celtic tribe that was annihilated by the Romans in about the year 800. It probably vanished completely. So we're in the tribe of the Dumnonii, the dwellers in the deep valleys, which also probably extended to Cornwall as well. But anyway, that was kind of part of our identity. And we are learning such a lot from talking to people in the global south at the moment about bioregions and how they inhabit their places, that we are able then to kind of bring back into our own bioregions, but because the global north has its own particularly potent way of kind of exercising influence on the world for good or bad, we hope this kind of validation in the global north of bioregional working is actually going to lift the global south as well. I hope that doesn't sound too arrogant, but that is our main contribution.
No, thank you. And these are really interesting points. And what I'd like to do is connect it to the next question. Peter has said, and I'll make a few suggestions or comments on this and then come back to you both, if that's okay. So Peter said, in Australia, when you look at the Indigenous map, although each group had its own land and area of responsibility, they were also connected, absolutely, communicating and working together for the common good. We're experiencing the impacts of global change with storms and floods, so we need to learn to work together. How? And I'd like to kind of connect both those questions. So in the work that I'm doing, kind of developing the steps inside our Greenprints model, which actually follow a lot of what you were saying, Isabel, about where you start with our, the environment, the deep history of ecology, and then the deep history of the humans. It really seems that part of that acknowledgement of the history in Australia's sense is also thinking about the impacts of colonisation, and almost links back to Ella's little connecting diagram of, who are these livelihoods supporting and who perhaps are they built upon? And certainly inside the work we do, there's always within that acknowledgement of country an acknowledgement that the entire Australian economy is built on many thousands of years of caring for country by, the people who were here first. So I think from my perspective, absolutely, Peter's right. The remarkable governance system that folks in this continent have and continue to have is about that interconnectedness. And Mary Graham uses those wonderful principles, including autonomous regard, that deep sense of, you're an autonomous person, you're part of this community, but I have respect for you. And it was the same. None of the communities had language words for invasion. They all worked together. They still had their fights, they still had their arguments, and then they had their patterns and rituals and coming together for different things and trading, massive trade routes across the continent. So bringing that back to my own little blurb is, I think within the models of thinking about bioregioning, some of that needs to look to the debts owed, both to the ecology and the restoration that has to be made, and then the social debts owed and the restoration that has to be made. But then also, and this comes back to my question to you, lovely ladies, which is, you're obviously connected in your own places. Are you seeing examples of different bioregioning groups connecting and communicating and sharing information and kind of joining up those dots the way so many people already do and people already have? So thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, there is lots of connecting going on between bioregional groups around the world. The bioregional conversations on our website, which I'll also put a link in the chat to, are an example of that. And it's constantly building. There are kind of alliances being formed around bioregional finance. I know somebody noticed that in the chat as well. There are alliances being formed around bioregional governance. So we are, in a sense, creating a culture where there's a lot of sharing going on and a lot of kind of mutual support going on as well. And we hope to be able to kind of, create more containers where this can happen and people can step in. And so the Bioregional Learning Alliances webinar series that starts on the 22nd of April, being offered from Gaia Education, will be a step towards that, of kind of 10 webinar hosts all sharing their experiences from their own bioregions and then sharing learning offerings that we will each be kind of, responsible for taking people on a learning journey.
Thanks. And Ella, I guess I'm also interested in not just the sort of the intellectual community or the online sharing, but are we at a point where bioregions that you know of are next door to each other and are being neighbours bioregionally? Obviously, local councils work together. That's a simple example in disasters or funding or whatever. But are you seeing any of that in your research, or did you see any?
Yeah, well, interestingly, I mean, Isabel will know about this as well, but right next to the Tayside bioregion is the Clyde bioregion, which includes Glasgow, which is, and bits of Edinburgh as well. So it's really major bioregion. They're right next to each other. And as I was doing my PhD, bioregioning Tayside, sort of like, really getting off the ground and getting things going. And in the Clyde, they were having a lot more challenges, finding people, engaging people, and so I think they are there, but the ways in which people are kind of engaged, it still relies a lot on, you know, having those bioregional weavers and those community people who can really get things going. And I think it's patchy in the UK, is what I can say.
I think it's
and
patchy
it's
everywhere.
different
And yeah,
here.
yeah. No, thank you. Both wonderful comments. I'm just going to jump around in the questions because I think coming to Jared's question, that fits exactly with what you were saying about, you know, trying to find people, and about my question, you know, how do we get people together and activated? He says, do you think some people tend to stand back just waiting for they to do something? I think individual reflection and self-assessment can help people to take increased responsibility for their decisions and the consequences of their decisions. So it was more of a comment than a question, but yeah, I think that issue about how do we motivate, activate, get people to do stuff, and with respect for the fact that they may have their very own way of doing things. And perhaps, Isabel, through your learning, sorry, what is it? What's the international one? The Bioregional Learning Alliance?
Yeah.
Yeah. Perhaps we'll hear about more of those examples of where some communities have worked out how they got things going and where some communities are struggling to get people together. So interesting.
Yeah, it was very interesting on our learning journey in June to really notice some communities just have the mojo. They can make things happen and other communities can't. To put your finger on why that is, it's really hard. But it is interesting to note that the communities who are more proactive and community minded and talk to each other, etc., they attract more people like that in. So it becomes like this kind of amplifying effect. So, but we did learn.
I wonder if that's almost the very nature of regeneration, isn't it? It's like a regenerative community activism because it keeps feeding itself. Anyway, please continue. Yes.
Yeah, so just a couple of thoughts. So one aspect of regenerative design is that you're constantly creating energy fields. So you're kind of looking at how do you bring the energy to the situation that makes people want to be a part of it? And how do you make it really enjoyable and really fun and really to the point? So it's kind of like there's that part of it. And then the other part is something I experienced through helping communities make community charters, that communities will come together about something they really care about. Like in Falkland in Scotland, it was getting against fracking because it would have completely destroyed their community. And in St. Ives in Cornwall, it's uniting against being completely overwhelmed by tourism and all the houses being built up for second homes or tourist lets or whatever. So it's kind of like finding that thing that everybody cares about. And then you bring in kind of like the bioregioning aspect is not just kind of how you think about something, it's how you make something happen, and giving people that experience of stepping into a space where you're really kind of thinking positively about the future and recognizing everybody has a role and that there are things you definitely can do. It's all of that. So there's no simple answer, but it can be done.
No, thank you. I couldn't agree more. It's very much to do with the cultural context and the time and the place. As Ella said, her PhD turned out to be an ironic example of working on your own to look at how people work collectively simply because of COVID. So yeah. Thank you. Howard's got a big question here. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I will paraphrase his question. He says, the general public are often confronted with the challenges we face, but I suspect it would be useful to have big or idealistic picture of where we're trying to go. Is there any attempt to paint a picture of an ideal world? And I guess he's saying in your work, are you looking at painting an ideal picture or where you're going?
Ella, why don't you take that?
Yeah, I was going to say that's a really it's a really good question, and I think also a kind of challenge for, again, for me, thinking about bioregioning as a verb, which is really focused on the process, is do you have that picture of where we're going and how shared is that picture? And I think that can be quite, you know, easy in the UK, where, you know, I spoke to Sam about this at length, is, you know, he's like, well, you've got no nature left, so it doesn't matter, you're just trying to make something that's a little bit better. So being in that process is kind of okay, that's an okay place to be. Whereas when I'm thinking about the work in Maine, this vision of like, what is that future and who is there? And are we assuming that it's going to continue to be colonized? Is that assumption there? So some of those bigger questions are much more political and much more difficult, and the stakes are a lot higher in some ways than they are in the UK. And so the answer is, I think there is a vision, and I don't always know how shared that is. and that focusing on the process kind of brings you into those questions. And sometimes it can result in people having those difficult conversations. And sometimes I think it says, well, let's put that to the side for now and think about what we're doing in the moment. And I think they're probably a broadly shared visions. But I don't know, Isabel might have a slightly different take on this, but I think a lot of it is like looking at the history and doing that process of saying things don't have to be the way they are right now is that first step. And I don't know if we've always quite got onto that shared vision of the future. But Isabel, I don't know what your experience is in Devon. Like, do you think you have that shared vision of the future?
We do have a vision of citizens having way more say, of citizens and policymakers working more closely together, of definitely our region becoming more resilient to climate change, but also living well. So this kind of concept of well-being and living well is important. But as we were talking about earlier, it's such a dynamic process. When I look at the world news and things change week by week, and the kind of context in which we're working is so rapidly shifting, both on the climate change front and the economic front, and what our local government here is doing. And so some of you may know that here in the UK, we're in a process of devolution, which means that our district councils are going to be abolished, and there's going to be unitary authorities, which means there's going to be a huge gap between what happens at the kind of county scale and what happens at grassroots scale. So we're thinking, well, can bioregions step into that? So kind of part of our vision as to what the future we'd like to see is kind of bioregions and bioregioning being in that gap. But then there's a kind of, how much do you convey that? Or how much do you keep that to yourself? Or, you know, you kind of share what you think is possible, and you try and bring people with you. But there's always these different layers and these different, you know, sharing what's appropriate at the right time is also part of it.
Yeah, thank you. And from our point of view, the work we do inside AELA, it's often the work we do is often reminding people that, you know, how we got here, how we got to this kind of industrialized society was from the multiplication of lots of little decisions. There was no master plan, and while we don't need a master plan, we do need some greater planning and greater input from more people with a clearer vision of where we want to go. And again, that's actually why I find bioregional or even ecosystem based an understanding of what ecological health looks like is almost that ground truth. The human world may flip-flop all over the place with different ideas, but the only true reality, I think, is what nature's up to and climate change, and they're the great guides of what we're up to. And then all the human world is just the barriers we face and the support we face as we try to go about making sure we have a place to live. But that's just our little AELA bias. So just share with you a comment from Anne. She goes, it's the mathematician in me talking here. Scale is key. The local or the bioregion is best seen and understood within scale. And she says fractal, infinite. And I don't know about you, but I'm connected to things like the Earth System Governance and the Earth Trusteeship Initiative and the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature and, you know, all the big picture stuff. And I keep telling them about the fractal governance. And that's what I see bioregions as this wonderful way of fitting into, not so much a new world order, that sounds very scary, but if we are going to move towards systems that literally can actually see the living world and the Earth as a system, then that's where the ecoregions or the bioregions and the ecosystems obviously play a part. So the more aware human beings can be of what's going on and how they fit together. That's just my thoughts. What do you guys think of that fractal idea? And how do you connect with different scales, perhaps, if you do at all?
We definitely connect at different scales. In fact, we were on a webinar recently that Bioregional Learning Centre organised, which was looking at moving the connections that exist between the grassroots organisations, the town and parish councils, the district council, the county council, and central government. So it's kind of really important to build this kind of vertical alliance. So you can talk to all of them, but then it's also important to kind of just do the stuff that you can do in your place. And I think thinking about, I'm going to hand over to Ella really to kind of say more about the way we shift our thinking about how we participate in co-creating the future. but I think it's demonstrating what's possible that is what bioregions do.
Yeah, I think,
Yeah.
yeah, to build on that, I think, again, this idea of bioregioning helps you kind of jump up and down scales. You know, sometimes you might be thinking of, you know, Casco Bay. Sometimes you're thinking about the Gulf of Maine. Sometimes you might be thinking about a whole North American system or a Arctic Circle even, which in some ways can be really powerful. You can draw those connections and those interdependencies across different scales. But at the same time, you don't want to lose what that bioregional scale offers. But I think for me, in terms of the shifting the way we think, what I think the key bit is moving away from this idea that the global is somehow inherently more powerful and more valid than the local. Like, just because a practice is global doesn't make it more powerful, more important, more real. And that the bioregion helps us, like Isabel said, to kind of demonstrate that the local, the regional is also real, is also powerful. And you know, scale, some people will be like, scale doesn't exist. You know, scale can still exist, but it doesn't mean that bigger is always better. So I think that's my kind of subjective shift that we need to do, is that, yeah, small is also, yeah, small is beautiful, small is powerful. You know, it's not just the global that's important.
Yeah, look, and I couldn't agree more. And I do love, you know, bigger is not always better. Even recently at a conference I was talking at, and I was sort of reminding people, I said, you know, the Western obsession with universalism, because it was an environmental law conference, it's not always great. I said, you know, universal rights for humans, yes, that's terrific. But actually, when we're looking at environmental law or environmental governance, it is the unique places that matter. They are the patchwork quilt that make up the planet. The entire Earth system is driven by all of the little bits and pieces in our beautiful jigsaw puzzle. So I couldn't agree with you more. I love that fractal stuff, because so many Westerners think in abstract terms endlessly, that bringing them down to earth matters, and reminding them that even if we have new regimes at the global level, some poor bugger's got to be on the ground doing that work. And we may as well do it from a place of love and deep understanding of our local places. So look, I think that might be a wonderful place to wrap up. We've just hit 7:30 Queensland time. And there's some really excellent discussions in tonight's session, particularly about colonialism and the debts we owe to each other, and, you know, the suffering that many people, even in places that were colonial powers, there's obviously a great understanding in the last couple of decades about what some people call the predatory class. In whatever time and place we're in, there are certain groups of people who do benefit from others, take their land, take their labor. And more I hear a lot of First Nations people saying, we're all in this together. And this day and age, we absolutely have to think about restoration, reparation for the past, but we also have to look at the present in terms of the social injustices. So I just want to mention that as well, that we're very aware that, particularly as we watch what's going on with the oligarchy emerging in the US, that the predatory class is going to take a lot of the resources that ordinary folks want to use for their own livelihoods and for environmental care. So we are definitely all in this together. But on that note, I really want to thank you, Ella and Isabel. This has been really a wonderful session. I've learned so much from listening to you, and I hope that we can continue to have some regular conversations. Please count us in over here in Australia for your Bioregional Learning Alliance. AELA would love to join that. And we want to keep in touch with your wonderful work and research. So I hope everyone can show their appreciation for our wonderful speakers in the usual daggy way on Zoom. Clap invisibly or press the magic button for clapping. But thank you, Ella. Thank you, Isabel. I hope you both have lovely days. Us Aussies are going to roll off into our night. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. One excellent conversation. And we've got some great speakers lined up for April, which we'll share with you all on our mailing list as soon as we lock in the date. So thank you, everybody. Thanks, Isabel. Thanks, Ella. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you
I
so much.
really enjoyed that.
Yeah, thank you. Nighty night. Good morning.